Hey guys, we wanted to give you some helpful information about Tale of Two Cities. A bit of a challenging book, but definitely worthwhile. It's the kind of reading that really trains the brain, so we hope you enjoy the book. First of all, I want you to bear in mind I am making the summer reading test as well as the presentation. So the presentation is designed to help you understand what you've read, help you really understand the book, and help you do better on the summer reading test and on the essay that you'll be writing later on. But bear in mind, you also have to read the book. You can't get away with just reading Spark Notes or just paying attention to this presentation. That is not going to be enough. You really need to read the book. You will thank us later, not only because you'll understand it better for your language arts assignments, but this is the kind of reading that helps you do better on the SAT and on all kinds of things that require analytical skills and reading comprehension skills. So stick with us. We think this is definitely going to be worth your while. I sort of suggest that maybe you read a couple of chapters and then listen to part of this presentation. See if it helps. See, kind of self-assess. See whether you're picking up on the stuff that I'm pointing out. I'm not just going to give you plot. I'm going to give you the kinds of things that most people miss when they read. This book, Dickens tends to bring something up on, page 3, and then it's page 53 before you find out what he's talking about. So we just want to make this a little more straightforward for you. So there you go. Anyway, so it's called Tale of Two Cities. There are sort of two pairs of cities. First of all, there's Dover and Calais. And there's also London and Paris. And you're going to see people go back and forth between those two cities multiple times. So Dover and Calais are the closest cities across the English Channel. So that's where people cross between England and France. It's where they cross now, and it's where they crossed in the 1700s when this book is set. Now, it was written in the 1800s, but it's set in the 1700s. There are obviously other options now. You can take an airplane. You can take a hovercraft. If you look at the bottom left of the screen, that's what the hovercrafts look like. They're really windy and noisy. But they're actually really cool. I've taken one. I highly recommend it. It's a whole lot of fun. But of course, the kind of boat that the characters in this book would take, just sort of an open air ferry. So cold, windy, damp. It would not have been a cool experience at all. Your other option now, of course, which they obviously didn't have in the 1700s, is the channel. That's short for channel tunnel. And you can see in the middle, this is an older type of train that used to go through the tunnel. They have nicer, newer ones now. And then the map on the right will show you actually where the tunnel goes. So it goes underground underneath the English Channel between England and France. So you can kind of see that there. A little bit briefly about the author, Charles Dickens. First of all, he had personal experience with poverty. He grew up poor. His father was in debtor's prison. He himself experienced child labor. So he writes about that kind of thing a lot. He's always thinking in terms of social commentary about the sort of crushing poverty that existed in this time period. And while it's true that he lived in the Victorian period, he is writing in this book about a previous time period that things were very, very similar. You also need to remember that Charles Dickens was paid by the word, and sometimes he'll give a really lengthy explanation of something. Sometimes that explanation is really important. Sometimes it's because he was paid by the word. So I'm going to help point out the really important ones in this presentation. Also, of course, we read this as a novel now, but I think it's important to understand it was originally published weekly. So that's one of the reasons Dickens will maybe bring something up in chapter 3, but not really resolve it until chapter 12, because he had to keep people hooked. He had to keep, just like a TV show, he had to keep them coming back every week. So you'll notice a lot of that. The novel is broken down into 3 parts, book 1, book 2, and book 3. Please note in the top right-hand corner, this is a poor life choice. Yes, it's a literary tattoo, but still, it seems a little silly to me, so I just don't want you to think that I'm suggesting that you get an important line from this book tattooed on you. Please don't do that. But anyway, when you see recalled to life in the book, it's a really important theme. You're going to see it a bazillion times, so notice every time you get that phrase, okay? So chapter 1, first of all, the chapter titles are usually important. I'm going to point out the most important ones, but do try to notice them as you read. Second, this has one of the most famous first sentences of a book in all of recorded history. And I want to look at 2 parts of it. So it's a really famous paradox. An oxymoron is a 2-word paradox. And a paradox is something that appears false but turns out to be true. It seems like it doesn't make any sense, but then it does. So if you look at the very beginning, It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Well, it's a paradox because how can it be both the best and the worst at the same time? Well, it was the best of times for the aristocrats before the revolution because they had all the money and power, and it was the worst of times for the peasants. But of course, that reverses after the French Revolution, and it's the worst of times for the aristocrats who are being guillotined, and the best of times for the peasants who have power and control in their own lives for the first time ever, right? And then look at the bottom, those last couple of lines. The period was so far like the present period. So he's saying there are a lot of similarities between the French Revolution and the 1800s when he's writing, that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. So what he's saying is people are just comparing his time period to the time period of the French Revolution and arguing over what was best. Well, he's making the point that people are missing the point. You're supposed to be thinking, oh, these people are oppressed. These people have all the power. What happens when that reverses? And you're going to see that a lot through the book. He starts off chapter 1 saying, oh, there's a king with a strong jaw and a queen with a pretty face and whatever. Here are the people he's talking about. King George III of England, and he was the king when America declared independence, and King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, his wife, of France. And so here are sort of official portraits of those dudes. Notice, first of all, when I put this in presentation mode, it messed up a little bit. So I'm sorry about that. I don't actually know how to fix it. But if you look here, Marie Antoinette syndrome is sudden whitening of the hair from trauma. She's always shown with white hair, but of course they wore wigs in this time period. But the story goes, some witnesses said, you decide whether you want to trust that so the French Revolution comes, she tries to escape, she's caught and brought back for execution, and that the shock and trauma of that turned her hair white. So I thought I'd throw in a little science there for you, Marie Antoinette syndrome, to see if that made you any happier. Also, if you look at the picture on the right, Marie Antoinette is famous for being told that the peasants were starving and responding, let them eat cake. She didn't say that. She was widely reputed to be pretty intelligent, actually, and she also gave a lot of money to charity. So she was a much better person than she's given credit for. I don't know that she was a great person necessarily, but she's not as bad as people say she is. That story actually comes from she was the Princess of Spain, Marie Therese, and she said something fairly similar. She was told the peasants are starving, and she said to let them eat the crust of the pans. So this was back before, there was like cooking spray or whatever, and so things would stick to the inside of pans when you cooked them. And she said, oh, let the peasants eat that because it's going to waste anyway. So she was pretty horrible, but Marie Antoinette, not as bad as that, really. Another quick, fun historical fact. George III of England quite famously said, nothing of importance happened on this day in his diary on July 4th. Well, first of all, it would be understandable that he didn't know that we had declared independence that day because it took months to cross the Atlantic back then. So there's no way he would have known. Secondarily, though, he never even kept a diary. He didn't ever say that. If you look at the middle picture and the picture on the right, those are actually photographs of Louis XVI's diary. So what happened was when the Bastille was stormed, that was the prison where people were kept in France, no trial, no parole, nothing. And so the storming of the Bastille is what really kicked off the French Revolution. Well, in his diary that day, Louis XVI wrote rien, which is the French word for nothing. And so that is actually much worse. And the story just got messed up like a big game of telephone over the years. But it's actually much worse that Louis XVI wrote down that nothing happened because he was in the same country. Like he knew, but it wasn't important to him at all that people were being oppressed and killed. So there you go. Dickens himself tells us, this isn't some English teacher interpreting the book. Dickens tells us he's going to use the woodman or the woodcutter to symbolize fate, and the farmer, ironically, to symbolize death, because you'd think a farmer would symbolize life. He's growing food. And you're going to notice that all the way through the book. So notice whenever you see those guys, they're going to show back up. And they're just symbols. They're not real people. And the next thing you need to remember, it doesn't sound at this part of the book that like it would be very important, but everybody in this mail coach is all bundled up. Hat, gloves, big thick coat, the whole 9 yards. You wouldn't know how big somebody was. You would maybe see their eyes, maybe their nose. You wouldn't see anything else. So if you were asked to recognize someone you'd been in a coach with, you wouldn't be able to. I mean, there's no light. The only light they have is, candles, which would be like a really dumb thing to have in a coach. So remember that, because Dickens kind of barely mentions it, and then later on it becomes really important. Also, just remember that there's a lot of social commentary in Dickens. If you think back to Christmas Carol, remember when you were a kid and you heard about the Christmas Carol and Ebenezer Scrooge, and he was terrible to the poor people, but then he learned his lesson and now he's good to the poor people. Dickens is doing something very similar when he talks in this book. I mean, obviously, Christmas Carol is also Dickens. When he talks about the punishment, and it's very similar to Les Miserables, which was written not too long after this book, in which somebody steals a loaf of bread and is thrown in prison forever. And Dickens is pointing out, you could steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family and actually be executed for that in England. So just notice that sort of social commentary. Remember, he grew up very poor. There weren't social safety nets. The government was not helping people not starve in the street. So this is a really, really big deal to Dickens. Chapter 2, the mail, is really short for the mail coach. This is our coach that delivering the mail. Okay. So Jarvis Lorry is a banker. He works at a place called Tellson's Bank. And this guy, Jerry Cruncher, also works for Tellson's Bank. Well, Jarvis Lorry is a banker, so he's, middle class, mid-level kind of guy. Jerry Cruncher is just a messenger, but they both work at the bank. So because Jerry Cruncher is just one man on a horse and Jarvis Lorry is actually in this mail coach that, is much heavier and slower, Jerry Cruncher is able to catch up to Jarvis Lorry and bring him a message. Hey, wait for this lady at Dover, which is on the English side, right? That girl is going to turn out to be Lucy Manette. She's really, really important. So just remember that that's happening. Lori just sends back the response, recalled to life. Well, the person who gets the message is going to know what that means. It's a metaphor. Remember, I told you recalled to life is really important. So file that away. It's going to come back around. In chapter 3, you're going to kind of start figuring out Jarvis Lorry and Jerry Cruncher both have 2 jobs. First of all, they both worked for Tellson's Bank, okay, as discussed. And they're both also resurrection men. Now, Jarvis Lorry at the end of this chapter is saying he's going to go dig somebody out of a grave, and he's imagining what the conversation with that person is going to be like. Just remember, it's all his imagination. It's like if you're going to have an important conversation with somebody, you go over it in your head and sort of plan it out ahead of time. That's what he's doing at the end of this chapter. But Jerry Cruncher is also kind of a resurrection man. You'll find out more about that later. Dickens doesn't really want you to know yet, so just kind of trust me. But a lot of things are going to parallel. So just like the first sentence of the book, best, worst, hope and despair, all that kind of stuff, there are all those pairs in that first sentence. The whole book is going to be like that. So stick with me here. This picture is just the real bank that Dickens actually based Tellson's Bank on. So I don't know if you might be interested in seeing that. So chapter 4, there's a huge long description of what Jarvis Lorry is wearing. That, frankly, is probably in part because Dickens was paid by the word, but also because Jarvis Lorry's outfit really characterizes him. So you'll notice he has the white linen. So he's got the white shirt and he's got the white stockings. This tells us he's fairly prosperous. Appearance matters to him because it's particularly white, and they didn't have, bleach and Tide detergent and all that kind of stuff back then. So it was tough to do, but it also lets us know that he's relatively prosperous. He had to have had a servant to do that for him. He would not in that time period have done it himself. So that's a bit of a character note for him. Also, his brown suit lets us know he's conservative, he's middle class, he's got a nice neutral color that's going to go with everything. And this picture on the right is fairly accurate in terms of what he would have been wearing. But remember that the suit is a good quality suit, but it's a little bit worn. So that means, again, appearances are important. He wants to buy a nice suit. And he's middle class. He can afford a nice suit, but he can't afford 100 nice suits. So he takes as good care of this one as he possibly can. You're going to notice all the way through that Jarvis Lorry and the bank he works for, Tellson's, are on the outside very similar. Tellson's bank and Jarvis Lorry are both very conservative and conventional, and Jarvis Lorry's clothing kind of shows us that, right? Now, toward the end of this chapter, you get this little couple of sentences, and Dickens never explains any more about this. He says a little fishing was done in the port, and he's talking about Dover here. If you look at those pictures at the bottom, those are the white cliffs of Dover. They're white because they're basically chalk, okay? And a quantity of strolling about by night and looking seaward. So at this point, you're going, well, why do people wander around at night and look out at the ocean? You would think you'd do that during the day? Particularly at those times when the tide made and was near flood. So the tide comes in, that means boats can come in, and boats are coming in at night. And you're thinking, I'm starting to put two and two together. Small tradesmen who did no business whatever, sometimes unaccountably, realized large fortunes. So somebody never goes to work and all of a sudden gets rich. I'm asking questions, right? And it was remarkable that nobody in the neighborhood could endure a lamplighter. Why don't they want any lights in the streets at night? Oh, they're smugglers. Okay, so there are a lot of smugglers, and it's one of the things that he's using here to characterize this area. And if you look at those two pictures on the left in particular, you'll see how the water can erode the chalk pretty easily, and it creates these little caves. And of course, it's not all that difficult for the smugglers to enlarge them a little bit and use them to hide the stuff that they're smuggling in from France into England. And of course, that happened a lot at Dover in Dickens' time period. So that's what he's pointing out there. Now, Jarvis goes, when he's talking to Lucy, that conversation is really important. There's nothing confusing about it, but make sure you read it. That conversation is really important. But we find out that Jarvis brought Lucy to England from France when she was about 2, and she claims to remember this. I mean, I'm a little doubtful, but okay, fine. Notice that Jarvis Lorry's appearance is very correct and conservative. You will find out more and more through the book that it is just an appearance. His real self is like a mushy teddy bear in there. He has a lot of feelings, but he doesn't really know how to deal with them, okay? And Lucy Manette has a lot of stuff going on in her life, as I'm sure you've read if you've read the chapter. If not, if you're kind of using this to prepare you, that's also totally fine. You'll know what to look for when you read. But bear in mind, to Jarvis Lorry, who's this man of 50-ish at this point in the book, he is a bachelor. He doesn't have any women in his life. She's a walking Taylor Swift album to him. He has no idea how to deal with it. So he keeps saying, business, yes. Oh, I'm a man of business. Well, you don't repeat it that much unless you're trying to convince yourself. So that's where we really learn about Jarvis Lorry. Now, the woman in red yelling at Jarvis Lorry for wearing brown, she's going to show back up in the book. She's actually a really important character. Her name is Miss Pross. She has been taking care of Lucy Manette for the last 15 years. I think Lucy's about 17 at this point, and she's been taking care of Lucy since she was little. And so she's yelling at Jarvis Lorry for wearing brown because she's saying, you look like this emotionless businessman, but actually, you're not comforting her. So Miss Pross is trying to take care of Lucy, and she just doesn't really know how to do it. Neither of them do. And they're going to learn how to get along. So in chapter 5, you'll notice we're in this neighborhood in Paris. Okay, so it's a part of the city of Paris. Some wine spills outside a wine shop. It's a cask of red wine. And so this man named Gaspard, as a joke, dips his finger in the red wine and writes the word blood on the wall. Well, Dickens, you have to read 3 or 4 pages to put all these little things together. And Dickens doesn't tell you that it's super important, but it is. So do try to remember that. Now, remember, too, Dickens is writing for a Christian society who would have recognized a bunch of references to the Bible. So here, this whole idea of spilled wine and spilled blood being connected, this is a reference to Jesus. Okay, and so the whole idea here is that the spilled wine represents blood in this book as well as in the Bible. So he's making a little connection there and reminding the reader that Christians are called to take care of the poor, right? So again, remember, this is sort of Dickens' perspective. You can take it or leave it. But in terms of the book, this is a little bit manipulative. He's expecting his readership to be Christian and therefore agree with him that these poor people are oppressed. So just bear that in mind. Notice that in this chapter, hunger has a capital H. Now, Charles Dickens is writing this longhand. I mean, there are no computers, there are no typewriters, there are no even like ballpoint pens. So every word he writes down is very deliberate. And when he capitalizes hunger, he's telling you it's not just regular hunger, it's got extra significance. So here it's personified. he's trying to point out these people literally are starving. That's how poor they are. And they're working, sun up to sundown, and they are still starving. This is sort of why the French Revolution happens, right? Now, the neighborhood is called Saint-Antoine, right? Saint Anthony was the patron saint of the poor. So sometimes there are, random names, and an English teacher will say, oh, this symbol means the thing. And you're like, yeah, I don't know. There's a pattern all the way through this book of names being meaningful and significant. So in this case, you're going to have to trust me. This neighborhood is named after the patron saint of the poor. Everybody in the neighborhood is very, very poor, and this is where the French Revolution starts, as sort of vengeance for this grinding poverty that these people have been forced to live in. So too many things add up. There's too much evidence that this really is a meaningful name choice, and you'll see other things like that later in the book. So remember the wine shop owners, Mr. and Mrs. Defarge. They're very, very important over the rest of the book. So notice everything that they do. They're not sort of random people who are going to go away in the book. Madame Defarge is always knitting all the time. And in fact, you'll notice that it's always the present participle, knitting. She never knitted in the past. She doesn't just knit. She's knitting. And that's really, really important. This knitting of hers is going to be incredibly important in the book. So every time it happens, notice that. All right, so remember there's 3 guys who came in the wine shop, and they're all named Jacques? Yeah, okay. So Jacques was a really common name, but it's not that common. You're going to find out in a couple more chapters why they all, quote unquote, have the same name. Okay, so stick with me here. All right, so you're supposed to start in this next bit questioning whether Monsieur Defarge, and see the M period, that's the French abbreviation for Monsieur, and of course we take our word Mr. from that, but whether Monsieur Defarge is a good guy or not, okay? And so here, Monsieur Manette has been released from prison. Monsieur Manette is the guy Jarvis Lorry went to dig out of a grave, right? And so the grave is a metaphor for the prison cell. So Manette is released from prison, and he goes to stay with Monsieur Defarge. Defarge takes Manette in because Defarge used to be Manette's servant, like literal servant, not employee, okay? And so on the one hand, Defarge takes in his old employer. There would be some natural resentment here, but nevertheless, Defarge does the right thing, takes in Manette, okay? But then when the revolutionaries show up, he charges them money to go in and see Manette. So he's kind of exploiting Manette to make a little bit of extra money and to get people to side with the revolution. So you kind of have to ask yourself, I mean, is he a good guy or a bad guy? I don't know, right? So stick with me here. That's going to come back up several times. Dickens only gives you about one sentence here that lets you know that Madame Defarge hates the fact that her husband still defers to Manette, like Defarge is still Manette's servant, which of course he isn't. He's owned his own wine shop for a long time now. Manette's been in prison for about 20 years. But you need to remember that resentment because it's going to come back in the end of the book, by which point, you've probably forgotten what happened in book 1. So just kind of file that away. Again, you're going to ask yourself the question whether Defarge is a good guy or a bad guy, because he puts Manette in this little room and he locks him in. Now, on the one hand, Defarge is making money off having this guy there, so you can see why he would lock him in. But on the other hand, Defarge tells us, and we just have to trust Defarge on this one, we don't know for sure, but he tells us that Manette was in prison for so long that he actually kind of flips out if the door isn't locked. So Manette is thrown into this jail cell for 20 years, no trial, no hope of parole. He's in solitary confinement, so he's miserable. This is terrible. You can see that he would lose enough of his grip on reality that if the door's not locked, it really does scare him. But we only have Defarge's word for this. So you've got to ask some questions about this guy. Now, when Manette was in prison, again, solitary confinement, so he's not doing too well mentally here, and he finally asked the guard if he can have anything to do, anything at all. And so the guard will let him make shoes. And so at least he has something to do to help him try to stay sane. Before he was arrested, he was a doctor. He's called the Doctor of Beauvais. That's kind of like a little nickname for him that you'll see. So just sort of remember that. Beauvais is where he was from. Ironically, it means beautiful view. It's ironic because, he's from this beautiful place, and you can see 3 pictures over there on the right, but then he gets thrown into a prison cell, and he's unable to see anything. So you can sort of understand where that would be ironic. And then, of course, he's so traumatized by his experience in prison that he's still making those shoes now, even though he's been released. So you would think somebody released from prison would be happy to be out, but he's essentially got PTSD, right? So this picture's on the right. The top one is kind of a famous park in Beauvais. The middle one is a convent up on a cliff. That just kind of looks really cool perched up there. And then the third one is the Cathedral of Beauvais. So just so you have an idea of what it looks like. So chapter 6, these pictures to the right are of the Bastille, and I'll tell you about them briefly in just a second. So first of all, Manette's voice is hoarse. This is actually really significant. All the way through this book, and I'll only point out a few of them as we go, but all the way through this book, Dickens is going to keep referring to Dante's Inferno. So Inferno means hell, and this is a big, huge, long poem that Dante wrote in the medieval period to talk about what he imagined hell was like, to try to sort of scare people into being better Christians. And you'll read it in 10th grade. It's really interesting. But at the beginning of the Inferno, the spiritual guide is named Virgil, and he's actually been dead for a long time. So when he's brought back from the dead to teach this spiritual lesson, his voice is hoarse from long disuse, meaning, he's been dead, he hasn't been talking, right? So Manette is also in this book to be kind of a spiritual guide to sort of lead people through hell the same way Virgil does in Dante's Inferno. And this is the first reference to the Inferno that we get, the idea that Manette's voice is hoarse. It doesn't seem like enough to build on right now. You're probably thinking, oh, she's reading too much into it. But by the end of the book, there are enough references to the Inferno that I think you'll agree with me. When Manette is asked his name, he says it's 105 North Tower. So that lets you know he's been completely dehumanized. He's been traumatized. He's not allowed to give his own name. So remember that names and naming are very, very important. Again, this is written for a Christian society, and in the Bible, when Adam gets to name the animals, it means he has dominion over them. So you take away a name, you take away identity. This is a big deal, right? But also remember, 105 North Tower was Manette's cell, and his cell became his identity. This is going to come back later in the book, so remember it. Now, take a minute and look at the pictures. The one top left is actually, so obviously in the French Revolution, storming the Bastille, they destroyed it. And you can't really blame them. It was a symbol of oppression. But they in the 1800s is when this picture was taken. And this is when they sort of rediscovered the foundations of the Bastille. So you can see that right there. The picture top right is a painting of the Bastille before the French Revolution. And so you see those columns, the sort of curving parts in the painting. The drawing below is a much older drawing, and it lets you know what those columns looked like inside. Notice the lack of windows. So you can see, how traumatized Manette would have been just locked away in one of those cells for 20 years. So then the last bullet point here, Manette is able to recognize his daughter because when his wife hugged him goodbye for the last time before he was arrested, she left 3 hairs on his jacket, and they miraculously didn't come off, and the guards let him keep them. Even though they so dehumanized him that they took away his name, they let him keep these 3 hairs. So you're just going to have to believe this. And then they turn out to be the exact same color as his daughter's, and that's how he recognizes his daughter. Remember that Lucy had not been born when Manette was arrested, so he's never actually met her before. And so she has the same identical hair as her mom, and that's how he recognizes her. And he recognizes her from 3 strands of hair. I don't know, man. Here's the last really important thing in book 1. So these 2 paragraphs, I don't know if you noticed them when you were reading the chapter, but do you see that they end the exact same way? Now, again, Dickens is writing this all out longhand. So he's not just lazily copying and pasting, he's purposefully doing this stuff, right? So Madame Defarge leaned against the doorpost, knitting, and saw nothing. And then at the end, she watches Mr. Lorry take Monsieur Manette and Lucy out of Paris in a carriage. They're being taken to England for safety. And she still leaned against the doorpost, knitting, and saw nothing. So first of all, we repeat stuff when it's really, really important, right? But she's standing there, obviously watching, but she saw nothing. Bear in mind, she's recording everything as this happens. She notices everything. She's really the person, the character in this book who kind of starts the French Revolution. So pay attention to this and don't believe that she saw nothing. In the same sense that Jarvis Lorry is like, I'm a man of business. I'm a man of business. I have no feelings, because he's trying to convince himself. The narrator is like, oh yeah, she didn't see anything. What are you talking about? And you're not supposed to believe it. So notice, of course, this is not an actual photograph from, the book or anything, but Madame Defarge is described as knitting 3 times, first of all, and you probably learned in 9th grade that's a really important number in the Bible that keeps coming back up, and so, of course, Dickens would have assumed that his audience would make that connection. But then also she's knitting while she's walking. I don't know if you've ever tried to knit while you're walking, but you'd have to be really good at it. It would have to be automatic for you. And so this lets us know that she spends a significant amount of time knitting, and that knitting is going to be really important in the book. So hope that was helpful. There is a presentation for book 2 and one for book 3 as well. So more later.